A homeless woman crashes an office party, but when the CEO sees her, he turns pale. "Ellie," he whispers in shock. "What happens next will leave you speechless." The office hummed with the usual sounds of ringing phones, clicking keyboards, and muffled conversations. It was a cold December morning, and Acre Langston pulled his coat tighter around himself as he stepped into the grand glass building of Lexford Solutions. The company specialized in corporate investments, and though Acre had worked there for 5 years, he still felt like just another cog in the machine. He was a mid-level sales manager, buried under endless reports, quotas, and meetings that rarely amounted to anything meaningful. As he walked through the lobby, he gave a nod to Gus, the security guard, a gruff but kind-hearted veteran in his 60s who had taken a liking to Acre. "Morning, Gus," Acre greeted. "Morning, kid. You look like you didn't sleep." Acre let out a dry chuckle. "Tell me something I don't know." Gus smirked and returned to his newspaper. Acre continued toward the elevators, checking his phone. His inbox was flooded with emails, mostly reminders about the company's annual Christmas party that evening. The invitation was extravagant, promising an evening of luxury, entertainment, and holiday spirit. But Acre knew what it really meant: small talk, fake smiles, and the higher-ups pretending they cared about their employees for a few hours. As he waited for the elevator doors to open, he glanced outside through the tall glass windows of the lobby. That's when he saw her. A woman sat hunched over on the cold concrete steps outside the building. Her clothes were worn and tattered, her coat oversized and fraying at the seams. Long, unkempt hair partially covered her face, and she held her arms close to herself, trying to shield from the bitter wind. Acre had seen homeless people in the city before, everyone had, but there was something different about her. She wasn't holding a sign, wasn't asking for money. She just sat there, staring blankly at the ground, as if she had long since given up on expecting kindness from strangers. Something about her pulled at him, but before he could think about it any longer, the elevator doors dinged open, and a flood of employees stepped out, chatting about their weekend plans. Acre sighed and stepped in, the image of the woman still lingering in his mind. The workday was the same as always: meetings, emails, and endless spreadsheets. But the woman outside stayed in his thoughts. During his lunch break, he found himself glancing toward the front doors, wondering if she was still there. When he finally checked, she was. She hadn't moved. Acre felt a pang of discomfort. There was something unsettling about the way she sat so still, as if she wasn't really present in the world anymore. As the afternoon passed and the office transformed for the Christmas party, with fairy lights and decorations being set up, Acre's mind was somewhere else. He found himself distracted, barely listening as his co-workers excitedly discussed the upcoming celebration. By the time evening arrived, and employees began changing into formal attire, the party atmosphere took over the building. Music played softly in the background, and the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. Acre, still in his office clothes, leaned against the wall near the window, looking outside again. She was still there. The sight gnawed at him. He knew most people would ignore her. They would step past her without a second thought, too focused on their own lives to wonder about hers. But he couldn't. Without fully understanding why, he grabbed his coat and headed downstairs. The cold air hit Acre as soon as he stepped outside. The wind had picked up, carrying the distant sound of car horns and holiday music playing from nearby shops. The streets were filled with people bundled up in warm coats, rushing home or to holiday gatherings, their laughter and conversations blending into the background. But none of that seemed to reach the woman sitting on the steps. Acre hesitated for a moment before walking toward her. Up close, she looked even more fragile than he had first thought. Her face was lined with exhaustion, her hands red from the cold. Despite the frigid weather, she wasn't shivering, she was too still, as if the cold had settled into her bones long ago. She didn't look up as he approached. "Hey," Acre said, his voice careful, uncertain. She blinked slowly, as if registering his presence for the first time. Her eyes, a deep shade of hazel, met his. They held something beyond mere weariness, something broken, something lost. He cleared his throat. "It's freezing out here. Do you want to come inside for a bit? Get warm?" She didn't answer immediately. For a moment, he thought she might ignore him entirely. But then, in a voice rough from disuse, she spoke. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. Not what, not who are you, but why? Acre wasn't sure how to answer. Because it's Christmas. Because no one should be out in this cold. Because he couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here, that she had a story no one had bothered to ask about. Because you look like you need a break, he said finally. And there's food inside. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine if he was serious. Then, without a word, she shifted, placing her hands on the concrete to push herself up. The movement was slow, stiff, as if she hadn't stood in hours. Acre stepped back to give her space. When she was on her feet, she pulled her coat tighter around herself. It was too big for her, the sleeves hanging past her wrists. Up close, he could see that it wasn't just old, it was the kind of coat someone else had worn for years before it ever reached her. A donation, probably. He suddenly felt self-conscious, standing next to her in his office attire, his coat thick and expensive in comparison. She glanced toward the building's entrance, then back at him. Are you sure? Acre gave her a small nod. Yeah. It's just a company party. No big deal. It wasn't a lie, exactly, but it wasn't the full truth either. The party was a big deal to a lot of people, especially to those trying to impress the higher-ups. Acre didn't particularly care about office politics, but he knew how his colleagues operated. Bringing an unfamiliar guest, especially someone in her condition, would turn heads. Still, he found that he didn't care. She hesitated for another second, then nodded once. Okay. Acre led the way, holding the door open for her as they stepped inside. The warmth of the lobby enveloped them instantly. She tensed at the sudden change, her fingers twitching as they adjusted to the heat. Gus, still seated at his desk, raised an eyebrow when he saw them. His gaze flickered to the woman, then back to Acre, but he said nothing. Acre gave him a small, grateful nod before guiding his guest toward the elevator. As they stepped inside, he pressed the button for the 12th floor, where the party was being held. The doors closed, leaving them in silence. After a moment, she spoke again. My name is Ellie. Her voice was quiet, but steady. Acre turned to her, offering a small smile. Nice to meet you, Ellie. I'm Acre. She nodded slightly, then turned her gaze to the elevator doors. Neither of them spoke again as the numbers above the doors climbed higher, carrying them toward a room filled with people who had no idea what was about to happen. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the grandly decorated event hall. Acre stepped out first, glancing back at Ellie to make sure she followed. She hesitated for a second before stepping onto the plush carpet, her worn-out boots almost silent against the thick fabric. The atmosphere of the office had completely transformed. Golden fairy lights were strung across the ceiling, and a massive Christmas tree stood in the center of the room, decorated with shimmering ornaments and wrapped in red velvet ribbon. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon, pine, and expensive cologne. Soft jazz music played in the background, barely audible over the chatter and laughter of well-dressed employees. Ellie tensed beside him. Acre could already feel the stares. He wasn't surprised. His co-workers were used to sleek suits and designer dresses, not someone in a tattered coat and scuffed boots. The murmurs started almost immediately, whispers passed between wine glasses and half-smiles. Acre ignored them. Come on, he said softly to Ellie, leading her toward the refreshments table. She moved stiffly, her posture rigid as if she expected someone to tell her to leave at any second. When they reached the table, Aker grabbed a plate and started filling it with food: roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, a slice of bread. He handed it to Ellie without a word. She took it cautiously, as if unsure whether she was allowed to accept it. Then, slowly, she lowered herself into one of the chairs near the wall, tucking the plate close to herself. Aker sat across from her, watching as she took her first bite. She chewed slowly, methodically, savoring the warmth of the food. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She swallowed and nodded. "It's been a while since I ate something like this." Aker didn't ask how long. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, letting the noise of the party wash over them. Then, a voice broke through. "Aker, can I have a word?" He looked up to see Greg, his supervisor, standing over him. Greg was in his mid-40s, with perfectly styled hair and an expensive tailored suit. His smile was tight, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Aker sighed and stood, glancing at Ellie before following Greg a few steps away. "What the hell are you doing?" Greg hissed, lowering his voice so no one else could hear. "Who is she?" "A guest," Aker said simply. Greg let out a dry chuckle. "A guest? Aker, do you have any idea how this looks?" Aker folded his arms. "It looks like I brought someone to the party. That's all." Greg exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. "This is a corporate event. Not a charity drive." Something inside Aker tightened. So, the CEO is coming tonight. And the last thing we need is for him to see. Greg's voice dropped even lower. A homeless woman sitting in the middle of the party. Aker clenched his jaw. "You know she has a name, right?" Greg scoffed. "That's not the point." "Then what is?" Aker asked, his voice sharper now. "That she doesn't fit in here. That she's not one of us." Greg rolled his eyes. "Jesus, Aker, don't turn this into some moral crusade. I'm telling you this for your own good. You've already been overlooked for a promotion twice. You really think pulling a stunt like this is going to help your case?" Aker's hands curled into fists. He wanted to say something, to tell Greg exactly what he thought of his priorities, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Greg sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, just keep her out of the way, all right? If Mr. Weston..." He stopped suddenly, his eyes widening slightly as he looked past Aker. Aker turned, following his gaze. The room had gone eerily quiet. At the entrance, a tall man in a dark suit had just arrived. He walked with effortless authority, his presence commanding attention without a single word. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the room with practiced ease. Henry Weston. The CEO. Aker barely had time to process this before he noticed something else, something far more shocking. Ellie had gone completely still. Her face had drained of all color, her eyes locked onto Henry as if she had seen a ghost. Aker frowned. "Ellie?" She didn't answer. Then, barely above a whisper, she breathed a single word. "Henry." The CEO's head snapped in their direction. His gaze landed on Ellie. His expression shifted instantly, from composed authority to something raw, something shaken. His mouth opened slightly. "Ellie," he said, his voice barely audible. For the first time that night, the party was truly silent. Aker felt the weight of the silence settle over the room like a thick fog. Every conversation had stopped. Every pair of eyes was now locked onto Henry Weston and the woman sitting at the far end of the hall. Ellie hadn't moved. She looked frozen in place, her fingers clenched tightly around the edge of the table, as if letting go would cause her to collapse. Her breathing had become shallow, almost imperceptible, and her wide, stunned eyes were locked onto the CEO. Henry, usually a man of unwavering composure, stood rigid at the entrance, his piercing blue eyes scanning her face as if trying to confirm that what he was seeing was real. His lips parted slightly, his jaw tightening. The moment stretched unbearably long. Then, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Ellie," he repeated, his voice quieter this time, filled with something unreadable, shock, disbelief, maybe even fear. Aker glanced between them, confusion knotting in his stomach. They knew each other. And not just in passing. Henry Weston, the billionaire CEO, one of the most powerful men in the corporate world, was looking at Ellie, not with indifference, not with casual recognition, but with something raw. Something deeply personal. Ellie's grip on the table tightened. Aker could see her knuckles turning white. And then, like a snapped thread, she bolted. She shot up from her seat so fast that her chair scraped loudly against the polished floor, nearly toppling over. Her breathing was ragged now, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Henry took another step forward. "Ellie, wait." But she was already moving. Without a word, she turned and pushed past the startled guests, weaving through the crowd, her movements frantic, almost desperate. The stunned silence of the room broke as murmurs and hushed whispers erupted in her wake. Aker didn't think. He just acted. He took off after her. "Ellie, stop," he called, but she was already at the exit, shoving the heavy door open and disappearing into the dimly lit hallway beyond. Aker cursed under his breath and sprinted after her, ignoring the startled expressions of his co-workers. As he reached the doorway, he risked a glance back. Henry was still standing in the same spot, his expression unreadable, his fists clenched at his sides. Then, as if snapping out of a daze, the CEO turned and strode forward, following them with a look of determination. Aker pushed through the door and into the hallway. Ellie was halfway down the corridor, moving fast despite the exhaustion evident in her every step. "Ellie, wait," he called again, but she didn't slow down. She reached the elevator and frantically pressed the button, her breathing coming in quick gasps. The doors remained closed, the light above it dim. She turned sharply, her frantic gaze darting down the hall. There was only one other option. The stairwell. Aker saw the decision flash in her eyes a split second before she bolted for the door leading to the emergency stairs. "Ellie, please," he shouted, reaching out just as she yanked the door open and stumbled inside. He caught it before it swung shut and followed her in. The stairwell was dimly lit, a stark contrast to the warm glow of the party upstairs. The concrete walls and metal railings made everything feel cold and distant. Ellie was already descending the steps, her grip on the railing tight as she moved as fast as she could. Aker hurried after her. "Ellie, talk to me," he pleaded. "Who is he? What's going on?" She didn't answer. "Ellie. Stop following me," she finally snapped, her voice breaking as she spun around to face him. Aker nearly stumbled at the look in her eyes. Terror. Not just fear, terror. Her chest heaved, her hands shaking at her sides. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked completely, utterly lost. I can't," she choked out, shaking her head violently. "You can't what?" Aker asked, keeping his voice steady, careful. She swallowed hard, her gaze flickering toward the stairwell door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. "I can't see him," she whispered. "I can't go back. I can't." Her words dissolved into ragged breaths. Aker frowned. "Ellie, who is he to you?" She exhaled sharply, closing her eyes for a split second before opening them again. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "My husband." Aker felt his entire body go still. Her husband. Ellie, the woman he had met just hours ago, the woman who had been sitting outside in the freezing cold with nothing but a worn-out coat, was Henry Weston's wife. The revelation hit him like a freight train. Before he could process it, the door above them swung open with a heavy clang. Footsteps echoed down the stairwell. Henry Weston had arrived. Acre barely had time to react before the heavy metal door above them swung open with a sharp clang. The sound echoed through the stairwell like a gunshot. Ellie stiffened. Every muscle in her body went rigid, and for a moment, she looked like she might collapse. Footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, descending the stairs one by one. Henry Weston stepped into view. His expression was unreadable, his sharp blue eyes locked onto Ellie as if she might disappear if he so much as blinked. His presence filled the narrow stairwell, bringing with it an intensity that made the air feel heavy, suffocating. Ellie took a step back. Henry immediately froze, as if afraid that any sudden movement might send her running again. "Ellie," he said, his voice low, careful. "Please don't run." She didn't respond. Her breaths were uneven, her fingers digging into the railing beside her. Acre could see the internal battle raging within her, every part of her body screamed that she wanted to flee, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Acre swallowed, glancing between them. He felt completely out of place in whatever this was, but he couldn't just leave. Not when Ellie looked like she was on the verge of breaking apart. Henry took another step down, slow and measured. "You're alive," he said, and for the first time, Acre heard the slightest tremor in his voice. Ellie flinched as if the words had struck her. Something flickered across Henry's face, pain, relief, guilt. It was impossible to tell. "I looked for you," he continued, softer now. "For years. I never stopped." Ellie let out a short, shaky breath, her nails scraping against the cold metal railing. "You shouldn't have." Henry inhaled sharply. "You just vanished." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I woke up one morning, and you were gone. No note. No call. Nothing." His hands clenched at his sides. "Do you have any idea what that did to me?" Ellie's face contorted, and for a moment, it looked like she might collapse under the weight of her own emotions. "You wouldn't understand," she murmured. "Then help me," Henry said, taking another slow step forward. "Make me understand." Ellie shook her head violently, her breath hitching. "I can't." Acre felt his heart hammering in his chest as he watched this unfold. This wasn't just a long-lost reunion, there was something deeper here, something broken that neither of them knew how to fix. Henry exhaled, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. It was the first crack in his otherwise composed demeanor. "Ellie," he tried again, his voice quieter now, rawer. "Where have you been? Why are you?" He gestured vaguely at her worn-out clothes, the exhaustion in her face. He didn't finish the question. He didn't need to. A silence stretched between them. Ellie swallowed hard. Her voice cracked, and she looked away, her fingers gripping the railing so tightly Acre thought she might break it. "I couldn't stay. Not after." She stopped herself. Henry's expression darkened. "After what?" Ellie closed her eyes, her whole body trembling now. Acre suddenly felt like he was intruding on something deeply personal, something he had no business witnessing. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to leave. Not when Ellie looked like she was moments away from crumbling completely. "After her," Ellie finally whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. Henry inhaled sharply, his whole body going rigid. A painful silence fell over the stairwell. Acre didn't know what they were talking about. He didn't know who she was. But whatever it was, it had shattered them both. Henry's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely audible. "Ellie." She flinched. His hands, which had been clenched at his sides, slowly unfurled. He looked exhausted, as if the weight of this moment was finally crashing down on him. He hesitated, swallowing hard. "I never stopped looking for you," he admitted. "I thought you were dead. Or worse. I thought," his breath hitched. "I thought you hated me." Ellie squeezed her eyes shut. "I don't," she whispered. "I never did." Henry took another slow step forward, closing the gap between them. Then why? He asked, his voice breaking slightly. Ellie finally lifted her gaze to meet his. Her hazel eyes were filled with pain so deep it was unbearable to look at. Because I couldn't bear to be a reminder of what we lost, she whispered. The words hit like a physical blow. Henry staggered back slightly, as if she had struck him. Akers suddenly realized what had happened. They had lost someone. Someone important. And it had torn them apart. Henry looked as though the breath had been knocked out of him. His hands twitched slightly at his sides, as if he wanted to reach for her but didn't dare. Ellie, he murmured. His voice held no anger, no accusation. Just grief. Ellie took a step back, the tension in her posture returning. I shouldn't have come here, she whispered. I didn't know, she broke off, shaking her head. I need to go. Ellie, no, Henry took a step forward, but she had already turned toward the door. Akers saw the panic flash across Henry's face. If she left now, she might disappear forever. And Henry knew it. Akers had to make a decision. Ellie reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling. And just as she was about to pull it open, Akers stepped in front of her. Ellie froze, startled. Ellie, Akers said, his voice steady but firm. You don't have to run anymore. Her breath caught in her throat. Henry stood behind her, unmoving, watching with a mixture of hope and devastation. Akers looked between them, then exhaled. You have to face this, he said gently. Both of you. Ellie's hands trembled. She swallowed hard. Then, slowly, she let go of the door handle. Ellie's fingers slipped from the door handle, her entire body trembling as if all the energy had drained from her. She wasn't looking at Henry anymore, her gaze was fixed somewhere in the distance, as if she was desperately trying to escape, even though her feet remained rooted in place. Akers stepped back slightly, giving her space, but he didn't move away completely. He could feel the weight of Henry's stare behind him, heavy with unspoken words. The silence in the stairwell stretched, thick and suffocating. Ellie let out a shaky breath and finally turned. Henry's eyes were locked onto her, a storm of emotions flickering in his gaze, grief, longing, disbelief. He looked like a man who had been holding onto a ghost for years, only to realize she had been real all along. You should have let me go, Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry flinched. I couldn't. You should have, she insisted, her voice gaining a sharp edge. It would have been easier. Henry shook his head. Easier for who? Ellie swallowed hard, her fingers curling into fists. For you. For both of us. Henry exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. You really believe that? His voice was low, filled with something raw, something broken. Ellie hesitated. Akers saw it, the brief flicker of doubt in her eyes. But she quickly masked it, shaking her head as if trying to convince herself of her own words. I wasn't strong enough, she admitted, voice cracking. I couldn't, she inhaled sharply, pressing her lips together before continuing. Every single day, I woke up feeling like I was drowning. Like I couldn't breathe, like I couldn't move forward. And I knew. I knew that every time you looked at me, you saw her. Henry's breath hitched. Ellie's hands trembled. I couldn't be that for you, Henry. I couldn't be the reminder of what we lost. I needed to disappear. Akers felt his throat tighten. He didn't know the full story, but he didn't need to. It was obvious now, they had lost someone. Someone they both loved. Henry took a step forward, his movements slow, careful. Ellie, he murmured. You weren't a reminder of what I lost. You were the only thing I had left. Ellie squeezed her eyes shut. I didn't want to be. You didn't have a choice, Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. Neither of us did. Silence settled between them again, but it was different this time. Heavier. More fragile. Acre watched as Henry inhaled sharply, steadying himself. I spent years trying to understand why you left. I blamed myself. I hated myself for not seeing the signs, for not doing more. And no matter how hard I tried to move forward, I couldn't. His voice dropped. Because you were still out there. And I didn't know if you were safe. If you were alive. Ellie's shoulders tensed. You could have come back to me, Henry whispered. I would have found a way to make it okay. Ellie let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. There was no making it okay, Henry. You don't know that. Yes, I do, she snapped, finally looking up at him, her eyes flashing with something fierce, something desperate. Because I tried. I tried every single day to wake up and be okay, but I wasn't. And I knew that if I stayed, it would only hurt us both more. Henry's face twisted with something close to pain. You don't get to decide that for me, Ellie. Her breath caught in her throat. You don't get to leave me behind and call it mercy, he said, his voice breaking. Ellie opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Acre could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. Henry exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. You thought I'd be better off without you. You were wrong. Ellie turned away, bracing herself against the stairwell railing. Her breathing was uneven, her body trembling as she tried to hold herself together. Acre felt something shift in the air, an invisible line neither of them knew how to cross. Henry took another careful step forward. I don't know what you've been through, he said softly. I don't know how much pain you've carried, how many nights you've spent alone. But I know this, leaving didn't make it go away. Ellie squeezed her eyes shut. Henry hesitated, then added, and neither did staying away. A single tear slipped down Ellie's cheek. She wiped it away roughly, as if trying to erase the evidence of her weakness. I don't know how to fix this, she admitted in a voice so quiet Acre almost didn't hear it. Henry swallowed hard. Neither do I. Silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Henry reached out, slowly, carefully. His fingers brushed against Ellie's hand. Just barely. Just enough. Ellie inhaled sharply but didn't pull away. It was the smallest thing. A whisper of a touch. But it was something. For the first time since she had run, Ellie didn't move. Ellie's breath hitched as Henry's fingers barely brushed against hers. The touch was so light, so tentative, as if he was afraid that pressing too hard would make her disappear all over again. For a moment, neither of them moved. Acre stood a few feet away, watching the fragile moment unfold, knowing that whatever happened next would determine everything. Ellie's fingers twitched, but she didn't pull away. She didn't step back this time. Instead, she stood perfectly still, as if testing herself, testing how much she could take before she shattered completely. Henry, still holding himself tense, searched her face. His blue eyes were no longer filled with shock or disbelief. Now, there was only quiet desperation. I don't want to lose you again, he murmured. Ellie closed her eyes, her breath shaky. I don't know how to be that person anymore, Henry. You don't have to be, he said softly. Just be here. That's enough. Ellie let out a shaky laugh, one that was laced with so much exhaustion that Acre could feel it in his own chest. Is it? Henry's hand moved slightly, shifting just enough so that their fingers properly touched now. The warmth of his skin against hers was almost too much. It always was, he whispered. Ellie inhaled sharply, her fingers trembling in his grasp. For so many years, she had convinced herself that leaving had been the only way. That disappearing had been the only way to keep from drowning under the weight of their grief. But standing here now, in this cold, dim stairwell, she realized something terrifying. She had been drowning anyway. She had spent years trying to escape the pain, only to find herself more lost than before. And yet, Henry, despite everything, was still standing here. Reaching for her. Still wanting her. A choked sound escaped her throat before she could stop it. Henry's grip tightened, just slightly, just enough to tell her he wasn't letting go. "I don't deserve this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Henry exhaled, his expression crumbling for the first time. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean we don't need it." Ellie opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. The raw vulnerability in his expression undid her completely. She had spent so long running, so long believing that she had done the right thing by disappearing. But now, looking at Henry, at the man she had left behind, at the pain in his eyes that mirrored her own, she realized the truth. She had been wrong. Tears welled up in her eyes before she could stop them. She turned her face away, inhaling shakily. "I don't know how to come back from this." Henry hesitated. Then, gently, he reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was as light as a whisper, but it sent a shiver through her. "Then don't," he murmured. "Just start from here." Ellie closed her eyes, swallowing back the sob in her throat. Acre, still standing in silence, felt like an intruder in this moment. But at the same time, he understood why he was still here. He had brought Ellie inside tonight on a whim, thinking he was simply offering food to a stranger. Instead, he had unknowingly reunited two broken souls. And now, he wasn't sure if he had been helping Ellie all along, or if, in some way, she had helped him too. A silence settled between them, but this time, it wasn't filled with tension. It was filled with something else. Something fragile. Something that could break with the wrong words. But also something that could be rebuilt. Ellie slowly exhaled. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to run. Ellie stood in the stairwell, her breath unsteady, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so long convincing herself that she had no way back, that she had burned every bridge beyond repair. And yet, Henry was still here. Still looking at her like she was something worth holding on to, even after everything. She didn't know how to move forward, but for the first time in years, she wasn't alone in the uncertainty. Henry's fingers were still lightly touching hers, as if he was afraid that letting go would cause her to disappear all over again. She wanted to pull away. She wanted to run. But she didn't. Acre shifted slightly beside them, as if reminding them that they weren't alone. Ellie turned toward him, her expression uncertain, as if only now remembering he was there. Acre gave her a small, reassuring nod. "I think you should talk," he said quietly. Ellie swallowed. Talking. That was the part she had spent years avoiding. It was easier to disappear, easier to fade into the background where no one could find her, where no one could ask her the hard questions. Henry gave her the space to breathe, to make the choice herself. He had chased after her, yes, but he wasn't forcing her now. He was waiting. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to keep running. She inhaled shakily and turned back to him. "I don't know where to start," she admitted. Henry's eyes softened. "Then start anywhere." She hesitated. Her throat felt tight, her chest heavy with everything she had buried for so long. Then, finally, she let the words come. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," she whispered. "I left because I couldn't love you the way I used to, not when every part of me was broken." Henry inhaled sharply, as if the words had physically struck him. Ellie clenched her jaw, fighting back the wave of emotion that threatened to swallow her. After we lost her, I couldn't breathe in that house. I couldn't look at you without remembering everything we were supposed to have, everything we lost. And the worst part? Her voice broke. The worst part was that I knew you were hurting too. I knew I wasn't the only one drowning. But I didn't know how to save either of us. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Henry reached up instinctively, hesitated for a second, then gently wiped it away with his thumb. The touch was so tender, so familiar, that it nearly undid her completely. "You didn't have to save me," he murmured. "We could have drowned together." Ellie let out a choked, breathless laugh. "That's the thing, Henry. I didn't want us to drown at all. I thought if I disappeared, if I took myself out of the equation, maybe you could survive it." Henry exhaled, his jaw tightening. "That's not survival, Ellie." Ellie closed her eyes, shaking her head. "I know that now." The weight of everything hung between them. The years of pain, the regret, the silence. But beneath all of it, something else lingered, something neither of them had been able to let go of. Love. It had been buried under grief and distance, but it was still there, woven into the way Henry looked at her, into the way she hadn't been able to walk away just now. Acre took a small step back, sensing that whatever needed to happen next wasn't for him to interfere with. Henry took a deep breath, running a hand down his face before looking at her again. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. Ellie let out a shaky exhale. "Neither do I." Henry hesitated for a long moment, then said, "But will you let me try?" Ellie's breath caught in her throat. For years, she had convinced herself that she was beyond saving, beyond love. That Henry was better off without her. But as she looked into his eyes now, she saw the truth: he had been just as lost without her as she had been without him. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she could ever fully heal, if they could ever truly rebuild what had been lost. But for the first time in years, she wanted to try. She nodded. Henry let out a breath he had probably been holding for years. He didn't reach for her again. He didn't try to force a happy ending. But for the first time since she had walked out of his life, she wasn't running anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. This story is not just about loss, it's about the painful journey of healing, about how grief can shape and shatter people in ways they never expected. Ellie and Henry were both broken, both drowning in the same storm, but instead of holding on to each other, they let go, thinking it was the only way to survive. What makes their story powerful is not just their reunion, but the realization that healing isn't about erasing pain or pretending it never happened. It's about learning to carry it together, about finding a way forward even when the past still lingers. Ellie's journey is one of self-forgiveness. She spent years convincing herself that leaving was the only way to protect Henry from the weight of their shared grief. But in the end, she sees that love doesn't mean disappearing for someone, it means staying, even when it's hard. Henry, on the other hand, represents resilience. He never stopped searching, not because he needed closure, but because he knew deep down that Ellie was still out there, lost and alone. His love for her wasn't about fixing her, but about giving her the choice to come back, about letting her decide if she was ready to face the pain instead of running from it. Their story doesn't end in a perfect resolution. There's no sudden, magical fix to years of heartache. But that's what makes it real. The beauty of this ending lies in the simplicity of it: Ellie doesn't run. For the first time in years, she stays. And sometimes, staying is the first step toward healing.